Today we're going to round out the curriculum that today is navigating conflict. So we're going to be building on the listening and the communication skills that we talked about in the previous two sessions and applying those skills to how do we navigate those difficult conversations or possibly even see them coming and take a different direction to not have them get uncomfortable and difficult. So that's the goal for today, is to give us some really actionable strategies to take with us. So we had listening, active listening. We had communication skills, where we talked about the 4 types of communication styles and how they work. And today we're going to apply all those things with real world scenarios. So when you leave here today, you'll have some strategies and some techniques to manage conversations and interactions with those in your life, maybe in a different way than you did before you came here today. That's our goal. So you know who we are. I'm not going to belabor this slide. We're going to move on. I'm Brian, that's Karen, and we're beyond thrilled to be here. Today we're going to go through a quick review. We're going to talk about the listening and the communication styles just to refresh memories and make sure we're all on the same page. We're going to talk about barriers and what they do to our ability to communicate and why do those barriers exist and how do they impact communication. I'm getting thumbs up from Debbie, but I'm not sure what I'm doing right. Oh, okay, the volume is up. The volume is up. Got it. And then we're going to apply personal strategies and team strategies. What does that mean? Well, we're going to get to it, but those are things that you can do internally, you're in total control of, and then things that groups and teams can do collectively to help navigate these situations and make them easier to manage. I want to start by just talking about this word, conflict. It's big, it's scary, it's literally big, but it's also metaphorically big in our lives and how we deal with it. Conflict is so complex and dynamic. There are over 100 terms in the English language just to describe conflict, because we're often at our wits' end. Like, what does this mean? Why is this happening? What are we doing to try and navigate this difficult situation? And so I just want to let you all give each other some grace. This is a hard topic. There's nothing easy about what we're talking about today, or we wouldn't be here. And it's sticky enough that we've come up with all kinds of linguistic hoops to jump through just to talk about it, just to try and have a conception of what it means. So understanding that helps you understand why we're here and why this work's important, but also challenging and not something that we're going to be able to finish in one single sitting. Integrated listening. So we talked about this in our first session. Anybody remember what the one-line takeaway about active listening is? What is active listening? Anybody want to volunteer? Save me from saying it. Yes, listening with the intent to understand. So approaching a situation with curiosity, just to understand somebody else's perspective. From there, you can offer up input, you can offer up perspective, but you want to first work to understand theirs. How do you pull that full perspective out? Confirming questions, mirroring, understanding that your body language is hugely important to the conversation. Does anybody remember what percentage of our communication is nonverbal? 93%, yes. Only 7% are the words out of our mouth. And so that has a huge impact on our ability to connect with people and understand their perspective.
And just to review our last session and our communication styles, as you recall, assertive communication is what we're always shooting for. At our best, we're trying to be assertive. There's a few times where aggressive or passive communication could be useful. Aggressive would be in an emergency or a crisis where you really have to direct people quickly, and that is an emergent issue, but you don't want to use that style all the time because it wears people down, wears you down. Passive style can be used sometimes when you're in maybe an unsafe situation where you can't really speak up. Maybe there's a power dynamic there. So temporarily you can use a passive style, but overall you'd want to move towards an assertive style. We certainly don't recommend using passive aggressive that style ever. I will say that in my yoga class yesterday though, somebody came in next to me and was coughing and seemed to have a cold. And I definitely gave them the side eye when I moved my mat away from them, passive aggressively. So, we can't really help it sometimes, but we want to do our best to limit it where we can. Some reminders is that assertive communication is about being clear, it's about being respectful, it's about talking as well as listening. All those things are part of assertive communication. And just a reminder that assertive and aggressive are not the same thing. Although when you're coming from a place of not really ever speaking up, it might feel like you're being aggressive initially to start using these tools. It's actually just being assertive. And practice will help you become more comfortable with being assertive. That's the next one. Communication is just about practice. And sometimes we have to go back and redo a conversation. And I recommend that all the time. If you leave a conversation and you feel unsettled, and you think to yourself, I actually really didn't say what I needed more clearly enough, or I actually thought about it more and I have another thing to say about that, you can always go back and say, hey, remember we were talking last week? I just wanted to follow up with some things that came to mind afterwards, just to clarify. If that can help the situation be more resolved, absolutely you want to do that. And then also awareness is always important when we're trying to learn more about ourselves. So here's the new topic for today, our conflict continuum. And the word conflict, as Brian said, has many different implications. There's many different ways to describe it. We initially pulled from a book called The Advantage, which was written by Patrick Lencioni. He also wrote a book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which you may have heard of. And these books are 10, 20 years old now, but the ideas are still really relevant. He talks about how conflict is on a continuum. Most people think that conflict, they'll associate this side. Destructive conflict is what people often think of as conflict, right? And when he describes destructive conflict, that's when we think of people getting blamed, people getting personally attacked or criticized, when things were never put to bed, the past keeps coming up over and over again, or people are really defensive. They don't really accept responsibility readily. That is absolutely one side of conflict. And when we think about conflict on a continuum, there's another side to it as well. On the other side is something called artificial harmony. And that's actually just as unhelpful, as the quote says at the bottom. The only thing more dangerous than too much conflict is too little conflict. So this artificial harmony idea is where people don't really speak up at all. There's a groupthink process. Groupthink is when we never speak up against anyone else's ideas. We don't ever offer anything different than what's already put on the table. And back channeling can really readily happen. That's another way of saying gossip, right? So we'll leave a meeting. We won't speak up in the meeting, but then we'll back channel. We'll talk about what happened and say our true feelings outside of the meeting, which is really unfortunate. So in between those two poles, there's something in the middle called constructive conflict. And this is where we want to try to get closer to. Constructive conflict has to do with taking a little bit of both of these things. We want to speak up a little more, but we want to do it in a respectful way. So this idea we could kind of apply it to our communication styles, right? On this side, we have some people who would be a little bit more aggressive. Over here, more passive and passive-aggressive. And in the middle, we'd want to shoot for being assertive. So that same pattern, those 4 different styles, we can apply it to conflict. So we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when we don't have constructive conflict in organizations. And we just say it's a ripple effect. So the very first thing that will happen is it's honestly just a small misunderstanding between two people that occurs, right? And this is actually sometimes even hard to recognize, where we might have a conversation and we leave it and we're like, that didn't feel great, but I guess it's not a big deal. Like, we're really good at just kind of ignoring things, thinking it's not going to be a big problem, and it may not be, but sometimes it can become something bigger. And so what can happen is if we start to talk about that situation with other people and try to garner support for our side. I can't believe this person said this to me. Can you believe it? Right? There's that gossip that starts to take hold. And what happens is that me and this other person that I had this miscommunication with, maybe I'm not really going to work that well together with them anymore. Maybe I'm not responding to their emails right away. Maybe they go down on my list of priorities of who to get back to and who to work with. Okay? So that productivity and efficiency start to suffer. Now, what we have is a missed opportunity where if we could address this misunderstanding right away, we could actually have a better understanding of the situation and have a deepening of that relationship because we understand each other better. When we're in a healthy organization, people can go directly to one another and clarify things before it gets too difficult. And my analogy for this has to do with, I think about conflict as like the Mississippi River, where it starts, you wouldn't even really know that it's going to turn into what it turns into when it's a huge, gigantic river down in the south. Where it starts is just this little trickle. And we can really readily kind of move that at that little trickle point, but we cannot move it when it becomes a big river. And conflict is similar in that if we can address things early on, we'll have a better chance of figuring out a better way through. But once it starts spiraling and becomes bigger and bigger, that's when it's just really, really difficult. So we address conflict at all levels, but we certainly prefer it when it's further earlier in the process. The next stage is spreading tension. So once people become a little bit more polarized, I'm talking to my people, they're talking to their people about this misunderstanding, it starts to grow, and we start to get people on different sides, and this starts to affect different teams, working together. We have, again, productivity declines, projects can even suffer, the company's bottom line can be ultimately affected. What happens when people are living in this kind of constant tension is that they don't really love working anymore with certain people, and they might actually decide to leave, or they might kind of sabotage themselves and end up getting let go. So that turnover is a real concern when tension goes unaddressed and conflicts kind of run rampant. We also have a legal liability risk at this point, right? If people are not treated well and they leave the company, they might decide to come back and sue. They might have grounds for that, they might not, but still it does take away attention and resources from your overall goal, right? Any litigation takes a lot of resources and time away from what you really would rather be doing. So how do we change that? Well, if things do start to grow, we might need to do sort of a bigger roundtable where we talk and learn from a lot of people about what their issues are. And it can really surface some things that we might not know about otherwise. So it could also be really important to do it at that point as well. The last stage, though, is organizational impact. And this is where if it continues, we're going to see, again, the productivity declines, project suffer. We might even start to know, our customers might start to even notice that things are not going well. We might start to impact our brand. People might not think of our organization the same way if these things continue. Certainly when people leave, our institutional knowledge is lost, right? People who have worked at the company for a long time, they take all that knowledge away when they leave. So that's a huge problem. And then the culture starts to change. The more people leave, you have new people that come in, they might not know the way things were done in the past. They might take a while to catch up, and the culture could absolutely shift in a negative way at this point. So another opportunity to come together. If we don't have this, we could collaborate, build resilience, work together to address these issues and strengthen our team culture rather than have it dissipate and decrease and minimize over time.
Okay, barriers. So we've framed conflict, we know where it exists and why it's a drag on teams and organizations and any group of people. Why are we starting with barriers? Barriers are a part of our communication framework that is outside the thing we're trying to talk about. This is literally another way to talk about misunderstandings. Somebody is tardy constantly, but there's a personal reason why. And if you had known that, it wouldn't be as difficult to understand why they're tardy. It's outside of the actual problem you think you're trying to solve. And that's where misunderstandings take root, and you start to have trouble, or you start to think you have a problem with a person when in fact there's just a context you don't understand, or something preventing clarity or transparency that's preventing that from being a more open conversation. You don't think you can approach it, but in fact, it's just something else that you need to understand about the situation. So what does that look like, or why do we have those things pop up? It could be a lack of confidence or skill. You're not sure how to address something, so you don't address it. You just fill in the gaps yourselves. Does anybody have an idea what humans generally do when they have a gap in knowledge? When you think you understand the totality of something, but there's little tiny gaps, what do we generally do? And are those assumptions usually on the positive or negative end of the spectrum? Yep, and that's natural, that's not a fault. I'm not faulting anybody for that. Why do we do that? We do that out of self-protection. We talked about this in the active listening session as well. So in order to protect ourselves against a negative outcome, we look and plug in things that could create a negative outcome for ourselves. So instead of asking about that or having the confidence to approach somebody, we just plug in a negative, because then it's all upside from there. And we'd rather have the upside than have something come to pass that was overly optimistic and we kind of read the room wrong. Perceived futility, so-and-so's not going to do anything about it anyway. And so if you see that as the outcome, you're probably not going to approach them or try and address the issue. And these are barriers to having those conversations that help understanding grow and take root. Or fear of repercussion. If there's a power differential, or if there is a long-term friendship that you're afraid of damaging, these kinds of consequences, when they're not well understood, can prevent you from moving forward with somebody in a way that will help deepen understanding. So where do we find these barriers? Where do they hide in our everyday conversations? Lack of psychological safety, the ability to trust that I'm okay bringing this to your attention is a key. We'll talk about that in a minute. Assumptions and biases. So-and-so's not going to do anything anyway. You're assuming that. You don't know. You don't know. We're going to do that a few times today. So those assumptions lead you down a path, usually in the negative side of the spectrum, to create a vision of the future that probably isn't accurate. Past unresolved issues. When I've tried in the past, nothing's worked. It doesn't matter. That team doesn't listen, or they don't care about the same things I care about. Those things carry with you. Early on in the active listening session, we talked about the fact that when you have an open issue with somebody, you have to close that loop. It stays unresolved. Your subconscious holds on to that. So not having those issues resolved carries forward to your future relationships and prevents that understanding from taking root. Power imbalance, we talked about that earlier. That's a structural difference, or possibly in the family architecture. Some people have different roles, and it can make it scary to approach that person for fear of the fact that they may have undue leverage over some part of your future. And you want to make sure you minimize the risk to that future by not approaching or addressing things. And emotional topics. The easiest one to cite right now is politics, right? People just avoid it like the plague because we're so polarized. So nobody wants to bring up things about our political environment or the direction things are heading. It can also be religion. It can be anything that has an outsized response from people in general. You just tend to leave that alone. And it may not even be part of the issue. You may just perceive it to be part of the issue. And so we avoid it. And that creates a barrier to conversation and creates the sense of conflict. So these things are not the actual issue at hand, but they create the conflict. So we're going to talk about how to manage these so that you can actually get to the root cause, rather than having these things stand in your way, because they're not the actual thing you're trying to deal with.
All right, so now we're going to talk about a concept called psychological safety. And this concept was termed about 25 years ago. A Harvard business professor wrote a book, Amy Edmondson, she wrote a book about psychological safety. And even though it's 25 years old, it's still just sort of trickling into organizations. People still haven't always talked enough about it. And I'm glad we're getting to talk about it here, because it's actually really helpful as a concept to think about how we can improve our own culture. So the definition is the shared belief that a team environment is safe for interpersonal risk-taking, meaning that I can be myself when I go into my team meetings. I can say what's on my mind, I can voice my concerns, and I can admit my mistakes if I need to as well, right? That's a really important piece. When there's a culture more of secrecy and not owning up to things, it's going to take a lot longer for mistakes to be rectified, versus when there's a culture of psychological safety and people can say, hey, you know what, I think I screwed this up, but I wanted to tell somebody so that we can figure it out and fix it sooner rather than later, and that person is not judged or blamed or criticized or ostracized. That's going to help everybody in the long run. So there's some specific aspects of psychological safety that create more safety, and there's other things that can be done that will create far less safety. So we want to go through these together and talk about some of the qualities that your team could have that will send you in one direction or the other. So things that create psychological safety, right? So encouraging active participation. This is where you go around and you ask everyone to share, or you call on people randomly in a meeting. The same voices aren't the only ones that are piping up all the time. You actually actively invite other voices into the discussion. And if we think about it, we want to make sure we're getting all the good ideas on the table. And if there's certain people that aren't sharing their ideas because maybe their tendency is to be more passive or they just aren't invited, we're leaving good ideas on the table. And so we don't want to do that. Also, modeling vulnerability. This is where leaders at all levels are able to admit that they may have made a mistake, whether it's present or certainly in the past. If we really think about how we get good at our jobs, and we're honest about it, it's because we make mistakes and figure out how to fix them. And then we don't make them anymore. So a mature, experienced employee can admit that and say, you know what, I have made those same mistakes. And I learned from it. Maybe it was 15 years ago or 10 years ago or 5 years ago or last week. But that's how I get good at my job, because I learned from my mistakes. So rather than seeing them as faults or trying to hide them, we actually embrace them and look at them as the next one, which is a learning opportunity, right? So making mistakes or having failures, we see them more as this is actually going to make you better in the long run versus shaming or blaming people for making a bad decision, okay? So getting away from that idea of blaming, more about learning. Practicing empathetic listening is always something that helps in any situation, right? So listening, trying to understand people's perspectives, and then providing constructive feedback. We'll talk about this a few times. Focusing on the behavior and the impact, not on someone personally. So I call it character assassinations, like somebody is just not committed or they're just lazy. Those are big characterizations, generalizations that are unlikely to be helpful. Rather than thinking about, well, this situation, this person didn't follow through on that to get to that deadline on time, that's more what we want to target. We don't want to talk about people in these broad terms. And when we do that, we do it with, it helps us to be a little bit safer when we know we're not going to get personally attacked if we admit a mistake or somebody brings it to our attention. On the other side, there are absolutely things that reduce psychological safety. That if we're doing them, things are going to go downhill. And so I like to point these out because if we can avoid doing these things, it'll actually help us improve things overall. So first of all is punishing mistakes, right? We talked about if people can't bring things to our attention, and if we expect everybody to be perfect all the time, nothing can be confusing, or we can't ever answer questions, or we can't ever go back and fix things. That type of presentation doesn't really help overall. Dismissing ideas or concerns. This can happen when people are brainstorming in a meeting or just bringing up ideas and people get laughed at or they get joked about or their ideas get, kind of flittered away because we're not really interested. Having that sarcasm or having those judgments coming at us makes us not really want to share again. That's just how it goes. So hearing that over and over and over again, people just end up not sharing. So the psychological safety goes down. And again, we're leaving good ideas on the table. If there are people who are coming to meetings and not sharing what they really think, we're not getting all the information we need. Gossiping about others and the situations. We talked about this when we talked about passive-aggressive style, that gossip tends to be part of that. If I'm talking to someone else about a third person, but I have no intention of going to that third person, this person's going to wonder what I'm saying about them when I'm talking to someone over here, right? That gossip really erodes trust. And everything we're talking about here directly results in eroding trust. And we can't have any sort of constructive conflict resolution without trusting one another. So this is particularly important in regards to trust. Inconsistent treatment or favoritism, this comes up a lot we work a lot with family businesses, right? So giving a job to somebody's brother or somebody's son or daughter or cousin, and they get treated a little differently, right? Sometimes their mistakes aren't that big a deal, or they get unfair treatment. We all are very aware of that. Anyone who's ever had a sibling knows what it's like to have things be unfair. As adults, we're not much better sometimes, right? We're very much on the lookout for things to be unfair. So when they are unfair, that's going to erode culture and not create a lot of safety. And blaming individuals for systemic issues. This is, when we think about a problem that occurred, the last person to have any, somebody left and they shut the lights off and they went home and something happened while they were gone, if we're only targeting that person and not looking at the bigger situation and doing a debrief or a post-mortem on what all happened to create the problem, we're not going to learn enough about it. We're going to create a situation where people are targeted and they're afraid of taking any action because they're afraid of being blamed for things. Versus over here where we say, look, that person had a part in it. They were the last one to leave that building or leave that situation. They might have missed something, but there was far likely to be other things that weren't into their control. And if we don't explore those systemic issues, we're going to run into that same problem in the future. Okay? So how do we start to make adjustments on psychological safety in our teams? There's some here's some ideas. One, manage our emotional triggers. So this means that I like to say this, when I get bad news, I sometimes have a reaction. I get mad or frustrated, right? Brian can attest to this. And when I was working as a director at an organization, I had people who started to become more afraid to come to me because they didn't want my reaction. Because what I didn't realize was that it sounded like I was shooting the messenger, right? This idea of shooting the messenger. I'm mad at the person who's telling me the bad information, but in my mind, I'm like, no, I'm just mad at the situation. I'm not mad at them. But until I learned that I had to clarify that and say, listen, I'm not mad at you. I'm mad at the situation. You're fine. That really helped. And people would start coming to me more and more because they knew, because I was really clear, I said it out loud, I'm not mad at you, but I need the information. So it's a way to think about yourself in these situations. Are you kind of a hothead like I was, Do you react to things? And are you making it clear to people that you're not mad at them when they're telling you things? That's an important way that you can start to shift the psychological safety of your team. Also, leveraging nonverbal communication. So paying attention to how you come across. As we reviewed, 93% is nonverbals. I talk a lot with people, not just in leadership, but also in families, et cetera, when somebody says, people don't come to me. They don't come and tell me what's going on. They keep secrets from me. They're blaming other people for keeping secrets. And I say to them, well, how approachable are you? Right? How approachable are you? Are people knowing that you're a safe person to come to? Whether it's with nonverbals or what you say, right? Is your door open when you have the availability to talk to folks? Are you present with them, or are you multitasking and distracted? Are you really giving them your full attention? Are you really trying to hear their concerns, right? Or are you doing some of these things where you're reacting strongly and then people just kind of shy away? So that approachability is something that we can all work on in terms of inviting people to talk to us. Sometimes if people are not approachable or haven't been for a long time, I'll coach them to say, you know what, you need to actually bring people into your office and ask them what they think. You need to start the conversation. People aren't going to start coming to you unless you change that pattern that you have established. The pattern is such that they don't come to you, you get mad about it. But if you really want the information, you can start that pattern and create a different pattern for that interaction. Using clarifying questions always helps when we're listening to somebody and trying to understand a situation. Digging a little deeper. Sometimes we might say, you know what, I actually don't want to respond to this right now. I think I need to get a little bit more information. I need to talk to a couple other people, but I will get back to you. So that actually helps, right? That we all want to feel like we all feel like we're unbiased when we're telling a story that we were involved in, but oftentimes we are a little bit biased. So getting the full picture can help us have a better outcome in the long run. And certainly if someone came to my boss and told them something about me, I would want my boss to come to me and ask me my side of the story, right? So that's another reason why asking more questions is important. And then simplifying your message. This has to do with, when there is a big issue or even a crisis, you don't want to say something like, well, that person deserves to be fired. I mean, maybe they do, but after one incident, it's unlikely that that's what's going to happen. You want to think about, let's think about why that person did what they did. Let's break it down. Did they get the proper training? Was there a miscommunication? Were they not on an email? Why did they not know what they were supposed to do there? Versus this bigger, reaction of they just need to be fired because of that one situation. Now, I'm not saying that some things aren't so egregious, but in general, we want to take smaller steps to figure out what went wrong, and that will help us target the right things. All right? This next slide is going to be part of the deck that you get, and it is our examples. We have 3 scenarios here that we are going to share with you in the deck itself. We're just going to go through one here today. So we basically lay out a scenario. In this case, there are scenarios during a team video meeting. One participant remains silent and doesn't contribute to the discussion despite being a key stakeholder. So first we want to identify what's going on with this person. Well, this person is demonstrating a passive style, right? Not talking is always a passive style. Some things to consider is we certainly do want everybody to be participating, so that's important. We may be able to bring that person in on the video call, or we could also follow up with them privately. And we want to build trust by having the whole group be a safe space for sharing. So these are all things that we should kind of consider. Are they happening or not? And then as a result, how you can respond is you can either respond in a group in the video call itself. We'd love to hear your perspective on this. What do you think? Or you can choose to follow up privately and say, I noticed you were quiet earlier on the call. Was there something you wanted to share? And then you may say something about, I'd really like to hear more from you in those meetings, and I'm going to be calling on everybody, actually, so that it makes you, maybe you'll feel a little more comfortable sharing. And that can start to change the psychological safety in that team. All right. We both need some water.
So there are more scenarios there when we send the deck out. We're just not going to take the time in a big group. So you can refer to them, use them, riff off them, build off them, but they're there for you for reference. I get to keep going. So we are going to do our first group discussion. So what I would like to ask everybody to do, excuse me, is use the paper on your table and just brainstorm some barriers that present themselves to you in your lives. It doesn't have to necessarily be at work. It can be at home. It can be in friendships. It could be on your softball team. But come up with some barriers and do write them down because we're going to build on that in the next exercise, and we're going to talk about how to address them. So we'll take like 5 minutes. We'll walk around and help juice the brainstorming. But let's go ahead and try and get a list of, shoot for like 5 to 7.
All right, so we're going to get started again. Hopefully you all have a few things at least on your list at your table, so hang on to those. We'll come back to those in a little bit.
So when I was walking around, I heard some themes that I've heard in every single session, all 3 sessions so far. So it's fascinating because those barriers are consistent and they're real and they're valid, and we're going to be able to work through some of those things. Not fix them today, but strategies, ideas on ways to navigate some of those things. So barriers, they're not an end to a conversation. They're an impediment, but they're something that can be recognized, seen, and dealt with. So all they do is exacerbate the sense of conflict. They aren't the thing you actually have to talk about. So it's important to realize that's why they're at this point in the presentation is they're in the way, but they're not stopping you. So now let's talk about some personal strategies for navigating conflict. These are things that you can choose to do yourself. Conversations are a two-way street. It takes 2 people to argue. I understand all those things, and you can show up differently in how you present and maybe provide somebody else a little bit of space to realize we can have a conversation here. We're good. We can do this. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this section before we move into the team section. So we're going to talk about 3 things here: framing, steering conversations productively, and then lastly, we're going to talk about constructive feedback, because you are providing that feedback. So this is something that you can choose, and this builds. So constructive feedback uses these 2 first things. So we're going to build towards how do we tell somebody that something maybe isn't exactly aligned with what we're looking for or what the organization, team, group, whatever it is, needs out of the situation at hand. So first we're going to talk about framing. What is framing? It's the way we use our language and our bodies and the direction and tone of our voice to approach somebody and deliver a message. We do it every single day, whether you know it or not. Think about how you approach a child versus how you approach somebody at your table versus how you talk to your kids. All of those are distinctly framed differently. And so you're already doing this. It's a question of being able to step back from yourself for a minute, realize that, and start to apply some of those skills in a more mindful and deliberate way. So how do we do that? We align our message with the person's communication style. If somebody is passive, do we want to come at them in a very aggressive way? Only if they're not safe. This is the only exception. If you're preventing somebody from injury or stepping into a road where a car is coming, yeah, get aggressive. But if you're sitting around a table, there's no need to make yourself big and raise your voice, which I can't even do right now, so we're good. So as you do that, you build trust and you open dialogue because you're meeting somebody where they are. Think about this physically. When you look at somebody talk to a child, a little child, and they get down on their level. That's what we're talking about doing, is how do we make ourselves safe for that person? So when you see somebody kneel down, they're showing that child, I'm safe. I'm not here to lord over you. I'm here to connect with you. Pardon me. This sense of safety you create prevents an emotional reaction. Emotional reactions stem from where? Bingo. That's the fight or flight. We want to prevent that and stay up here in the prefrontal cortex. And so when we make ourselves safe for somebody, we prevent that emotional reaction from happening. Framing does that. That's the skill we're talking about. And then from there, you can deliver messages clearly because you're talking to somebody on the same level. You're dealing with them in a way that lets them know that you're there to simply connect and be heard and understood, not to threaten or to take away their safety in some way.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about steering. And personally, I can steer a conversation kind of a lot, right? I mean, this is a skill that I use a lot. We use a lot at working with people. How do we make sure a conversation stays on track? When I notice somebody getting off track or getting, agitated or shutting down, how can we get that person back on the same track that we want to be moving in the same direction? So steering is one of the ways to do that. So when we're thinking about these different communicators, what comes to mind when talking to an aggressive communicator, one way to steer is to maintain your own composure, right? Like Brian said, it takes two people to argue. So if one person's trying to argue with you, but you're not arguing back, well then you're going to be able to you're not going to go off track with them. You're going to be able to bring them a little bit back, into their prefrontal cortex. It will help to do things like validate their frustration if they seem to be upset, right? Validate that. Don't ever try to tell people to calm down though. That never goes well, right? Nobody likes to be told to calm down, but you can help people calm down by the way that you talk to them. If you're talking in a calm tone, if you're validating what they're saying, and you're not arguing back with them, that will be a way to bring them back down, putting them back in the prefrontal cortex, and then you're back on the same page and you can keep moving in the same direction. You might have to do that more than once in a conversation though, and that's okay. Just continue to bring the person back to the middle where you want them to go. Working with passive folks, this is where essentially you want to create a supportive environment and be really inviting. You want to invite, maybe if you have a whole circle of folks at a table, we're gonna hear from everybody, knowing that there's some passive people in the audience. Or like we said earlier, after a meeting and you didn't hear from somebody, to go up to them privately and say, hey, I'd really love to hear your feedback or your thoughts about this issue, which that starts to gently encourage them, especially if they have good ideas, to say, gosh, I really hope you can share those next time, or I hope, can I help you share more? Would it be okay if I called on you at times? Because I think your input's really valuable, right? So encouraging those passive communicators so they can build that confidence that their ideas are really valuable. With passive aggressive folks, generally what I think about is people are being really kind of vague, right? So they're either giving vague direction, they're not really giving clear direction, or they're giving kind of vague accountability, like did they do something, did they not do something, is it complete, is it not complete? So that passive aggressive style can be very hard, but something that can be helpful is to think about how can I make this a yes or an either or situation. So I like to say things like, I'm a little confused. I thought you said you could handle that project or you wanted to do that project, but actually it's not done. So are you too busy, or would you be able to finish it by Friday? Right? It's an either or situation where you give them one of two choices. Because people who are passive aggressive tend to kind of live in that gray area where it's hard to nail them down. So to figure out two choices, and if they can pick one, that could help them, and it helps you steer the conversation to something more productive, okay? And then assertive communicators, they don't really need any help. You know, what you see is what you get with those folks. They're direct in general. They'll tell you if they finished something or needed help, so you don't really have to adjust too much. They're generally moving in the same direction as you anyway. So that makes it easier to steer the conversation. Another style that we can use for ourselves in different situations is the art of constructive feedback. And so there's 4 different areas here. You can use one of these. You could use all of them in one conversation, but each of them can be utilized independently. We're going to talk about one example using each one. So the first one is to be specific, right? You really want to focus on the person's behavior, and we'll talk about this later too. The behavior, not, doing a character assassination, not making a personal attack on them. So if we have an example of, say, someone who took a PTO day and didn't have a backup. They didn't provide a backup for who to call in their absence. And some things happened in their absence, and it was a problem, right? So identifying that was the issue, you didn't actually get a backup person for yourself when you were gone, versus, you're clearly not a team player, which is a more generalization of their behavior, which is probably not necessarily true. We don't know. We want to target the behavior and work from there. The next piece is to balance positive and negative thoughts about this person. So in this case, you could say, I know you've actually been far more of, you've been helping other team members. You're really the first person to respond lately when other people need help. So it's just a little confusing where, when you took PTO, you didn't have anybody to replace you. And we did have some problems because of that, right? So adding that positive piece to also the problem at hand. Offering solutions. In this case, you'd want to say, if you can't find somebody to back you up, you can always call me, or you could call your supervisor, just so that it's not a surprise to us when you're gone, right? Whether or not they can solve that problem, remains to be seen, but at least let someone know that you couldn't find somebody to back you up. And then encouraging dialogue. So when you're not sort of like just chastising someone or yelling at them, shaking your finger at them, you're saying, help me understand what happened. You might find out that there was some real miscommunication. Maybe nobody went over the PTO policy with them really clearly and they didn't know. Maybe they did ask someone, but they sent it to the wrong email address and the person didn't get it. I mean, there's so many ways that, once we investigate, we could find that this person maybe didn't have as much fault and there was a bigger issue, and that we can correct that bigger issue once we investigate a little bit more, okay? And this is another example that's going to be in your slide deck, and we don't really have time to go through all of them, but here's an example of one. So using some of these techniques, our example is redirecting an off-topic discussion. So if you see somebody aggressively going off topic, you can steer them back by saying something like, I hear what you're saying, but let's keep our attention on the current topic so we can stay productive. Actually, don't say but. Just never say but. If someone's passive, you could steer them also, saying, that's a really good point. How do you think it connects to the current focus, right? So they're talking about something else, but you want them to steer them back. That's another way to do that. Framing, for someone who's passive aggressive, giving a bigger context. It sounds like this is really important to you. They're passionately talking about something, but they're off topic. So we're acknowledging that this is important to them, and we can make some time for it, but just not right now, right? Let's make a note and come back to it after we finish. And then steering an assertive participant who also might be off thinking about something that's really important to them, just being really direct. Hey, we got to refocus. We can cover everything we need to today. Let's just stay on track and we can get to that. We can put that on our next agenda, being really direct. So the rest of those will be in your PowerPoint slide packet.
Yeah, so you'll have all those examples to refer to and build off of and reference in terms of your day-to-day. We're going to do now the next group exercise where we're going to talk about the barriers we identified in the first chat. And what we want to do now is see what of these personal strategies can we apply to those barriers to try and overcome them and remove them as barriers. Because remember, we're not actually to the root cause yet. The barrier is standing in our way. And so what can we do to try and negate that or counteract it or remove it entirely? So we'll walk around, we'll take 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll come back together. Thank you all for engaging. This has been great. The group sessions are my favorite part of this. It's been going really, really great. So wrapping up, personal strategies. Communication obviously is a two-way street, but there are things you can bring to those interactions to help them go better, to tee them up for success. And you don't need to have a counterpart that's necessarily playing ball with you. Trust me, the more of these kinds of things you practice, the more people will open up to you and want to connect with you and communicate with you. That's the whole point. Creating that sense of psychological safety is something that we can do as individuals for each other as we go through our relationships in our life.
All right, so everything we've talked about up to this point, you could use, anywhere. If you were in the line at Starbucks and somebody cut you, you could assertively respond to them, right? Or if it's like a person you don't see very often or someone, just an acquaintance around town, you could use these strategies with anyone, anywhere. There's another category, though, that involves when we're part of a team. So a team, the way we like to talk about it is it's 2 or more people that work together on projects and have repeated interactions with each other, okay? So that's not strangers, that's not like acquaintances, very much, they don't see very much. These are people that you see day in and day out. So being part of a team, obviously a workplace team, your marriage is a team. Your family is a team. You're working together with people that you see every single day in and day out, on projects, whether it's, your family dynamic or family vacations or family schedules or, any of those things. So what starts to happen when we have teams is that we start to notice some patterns of interactions, right? We interact with the same people in the same way. We start to develop habits. And sometimes those patterns and habits they move us forward, but sometimes they start to become barriers or get in the way of being productive and moving forward. So that's where conflict comes in. Conflict most often arises in a team, right? We don't really get so much into conflict with people we don't engage with very much. I mean, we could, but what's the point of, it's going to be a short-lived conflict with the person in Starbucks. You're never going to see them again. So conflicts are really more about people that we see, have to do with people that we see on a regular basis. And they often start when we have 2 people with opposing viewpoints, okay? So we have this diagram here of 2 gears, and I'm going to use this very general example of 2 people with opposing viewpoints. We're going to pick these viewpoints as one person's very, likes to take risks and likes to try new things and is sort of adventurous and has creativity, and the other person is more risk averse. They like to take things a little more slowly. They like to know the data. They like to check things. They like to go a little bit more slowly. And in organizations, these 2 styles are often at odds, okay? So for example, in organizations, we're just going to be really general here. We're not talking about anybody specific. But we often see risk-averse people might be in the finance department, right? They're worried about the cash flow. They're worried about the reserves. We don't want to spend a lot of money because we want to make sure we have some because we want longevity. We want to be around for a long time. So their goal is for the organization to be around for a long time, but they do it in a way where it seems like they don't want to try new things. Now we have someone else, maybe the CEO or the executive director or somebody in marketing who's like, hey, I got some great ideas. We got to bring new people or sales, right? We got to bring some new people in. We got to replace some of the old customer base. We got to get a new customer base. We got to bring new people in, new demographics. We have these programs that we're going to do. That all costs money. We need to spend money to keep the organization going. So their goal is also to keep longevity in the organization, but they're coming at it from a different perspective. And in really healthy organizations, these 2 sides, these 2 gears appreciate each other. And they recognize the need for both. So if you have an organization which is very, more risk-taking, Typically, it's like a startup company where they kind of spend a lot of money really fast, hire a bunch of people, scale up quickly, but if they can't sustain it, they crash and burn, and they close within a year or two. If you have people who are only risk averse at an organization, and they won't try new things, and they won't spend money, and they won't kind of do outreach and try to increase sales, well, those organizations kind of die a slow death. They can't sustain themselves because they're not getting any new energy, new growth, new customers, new clients. So healthy organizations recognize the need for both perspectives because we're all in service of the same thing. We all want the organization to grow and be around for many, many years. And when we can appreciate those two perspectives and work together, these gears drive each other forward. But when we don't see that, it's like throwing sand in them and everything screeches to a halt, and it's really hard to get anything done. Okay? So when we're in relationships with people and we have different perspectives, one thing to think about is we're likely both on the same page somewhere. How can we find that page that we're both on? How do we share a forward, common thinking about a situation? And that makes it easier for us both to get on board versus polarizing ourselves, right? I'm gonna be in my camp, I'm gonna say no, no, no to everything, and I'm gonna be in my camp, and I'm gonna say we gotta try this new thing, and this new thing, and this new thing, and we don't get anywhere. Nobody's happy. So that's often how the root of conflict too in these ongoing relationships that go on and on and on, is when two people have opposing viewpoints. So we wanna actually appreciate these different viewpoints, not demonize them.
So let's talk a bit about now how do we step towards those viewpoints and balance things. So this is where we're getting to the meat of interacting with folks and having some difficult conversations that may or may not create friction between the two of you. So first I want to talk about separating the person from the issue. I'm going to use Karen's example from before about somebody who didn't find coverage and they took a PTO day. And so it is one way to open up the conversation with some statement that starts with "you always." You always leave us high and dry. Did I even mention the coverage? Or did I introduce shame into the dynamic? And so I've steered my way out of a productive conversation. We talked about steering before. I've steered right off the road. And now I've made it about that person's integrity, their commitment to the team, their commitment to their role, whatever it may be, versus asking for some input. Hey, help me understand what happened last week, and I saw you took a day off. Is everything okay? We may learn that a kiddo ended up in the hospital. I went. I've done that. Right? I always go to the extreme because it just helps frame the understanding. But we started with a sense of curiosity, which we talked about in the active listening session. We also could come at this trying to understand where they're landing based on their particular presentation. So to use the example from the previous slide, if they're risk averse, say, hey, generally speaking, coverage is like your top priority, and I noticed last week we had a gap. Let's talk about why that happens so that we can get around it in the future. You're already playing to the fact that they like to remove risk, and you're helping collaborate with them on how this won't happen again. No shame in that. That's forward-looking, and that's the ability to grab something and make it better the next time. Because do we really want to attack the character of an individual or solve the problem so it doesn't happen again? All of this, all three sessions, are driving us towards solving the problem so it doesn't happen again. It's not about somebody's nefarious intent. There are people with negative intent, and there are different ways to deal with that. These techniques help shine a sunlight on that. Sunlight gives you the ability to say, like, oh, you really just don't care. Okay, I've had the conversations enough to now escalate this, and we can deal with it differently. Because the problem isn't actually the missed day. The problem is actually that they really don't care, they're checked out, something like that. But only if you show up with curiosity would you learn that. Because if you show up in a way that introduces shame, that becomes the thing we're talking about. So again, we want to not conflate the person and the issue, stay issue focused, and we're going to go through a way to do that here in a minute. And then from there, we want to focus on the issue at hand and the impact it made. And how do we do that? We do that with, there are many ways. Let me point this out. There's many ways to do this. If you Google separating the person from the issue, there's tons of armchair quarterbacks out there that'll tell you exactly how to do it. So this is just one way. And I think it's super easy to understand because there's 3 letters and everybody can remember 3 letters. Humans are good at up to 7. I'm only asking you for 3. So we're good. Situation, behavior, impact. Okay? The I is not individual, it's impact. So what does this mean? This is an easy way to remember and model feedback for somebody that keeps it about the incident, the thing, whatever happened. Describe the situation. Last week, we were left without coverage on Tuesday. That's a situation. We noticed that you had coverage and you were out. That's the behavior. The impact is we were short and we weren't able to answer customer calls or whatever the thing may be. Impact. So you want to tie the behavior to the consequence to the organization. Because if there really was no consequence, what are we addressing? Maybe it's a different kind of conversation. The impact is helping to shine a light on the consequence of the action so that we can address it differently. It may be that the behavior was necessary. And so, okay, we can acknowledge that, but now next time we need a different set of things to happen when that behavior becomes necessary, when your kiddo is sick or whatever it may be. We want to be able to have a different framework in place so that we're not left short. And we can accommodate the fact that this need existed. It's not negating what they did. It's finding a way to really fully understand it and then address it completely so that as we move forward, it's not an issue in the future. So it's very straightforward. Situation, behavior, impact. If you remember those 3 things, you can address nearly any issue with a person and keep yourself well on the guardrails and off the shame road. Because shame is the #1 derailer of these conversations. Humans do not want to feel that. It's really, really uncomfortable. And it's not necessary in order to actually understand what happened. So all of the skills we've been talking about, active listening, understanding communication styles, understanding and managing barriers, are to help us stay focused on the issue and not the person that may or may not have had a hand in that issue coming to bear or negatively impacting anybody. All of this has been to do that. If you have conversations with people in this model, what are you going to build as you come out of that conversation and move forward? One word. Yeah, you guys have been listening. That's awesome. Yeah. So you can take this. This will be in the deck. If you tie this back to the session last time on communication styles, these are I statements. We had a whole section on the I statements about how to talk about things with people, not about them, but about you. So you can describe your experience. The impact is most likely going to be your experience of the situation. They may or may not have been around. They may have been, and in our example, the person wasn't there. They don't know what happened. And so these, if you want to tie this back, the through line here is those I statements.
You keep it for a second?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I just want to say one more thing about shame and guilt. I told you I was a therapist for a long time, and this comes up a lot, that sometimes we use them interchangeably, but I like to point out to what Brian said, that shame is about I'm somehow defective as a person, or I'm inadequate, or I'm ashamed of myself, where guilt is a little bit more productive. It's like I did something that I feel bad about, and I can recover much more easily from guilt. So when you're using these, the SBI framework, you might have people feeling a bit guilty about what they did, and that's far easier to process and deal with than if that you shame them, that there's somehow something inadequate about them, or they can't handle this job or whatnot. We don't want to go there because we can't recover from that as humans. That just makes us want to hide or just kind of keep secrets and not really share when things are coming up and are going on. So the guilt, sometimes, guilt can be more productive. I mean, it's not great, but it's certainly better than shame. And sometimes, that's a little bit of an extra motivation for people to do it different next time. I don't want to feel that level of guilt. I don't want to disappoint my leader or my manager or my team member because I understand the impact now. I didn't get it before, and now if I were to do it again, I would definitely feel bad because I know how it's affecting the other person, okay?
Yeah, if you were to take this conversation and play it out on the shame and guilt sides of the scale, if you were to introduce shame into the conversation, you're probably going to get a response that starts with something to the effect of "you're wrong." And if you started off and you introduce some level of guilt, first, you can't make somebody feel guilty. But if they feel that, you might hear something like, "Thanks, I had no idea. I regret that happened. I had no idea." It's a very different reaction that you're getting by helping people see things differently.
Okay. All right, so another strategy that's useful with teams is this collaborative problem-solving technique. And collaboration is one of our, I think, favorite words. We love people who are collaborating. We want to help people collaborate because everybody feels better when we're all on the same page, we're all working together, we're all moving in the same direction. So this is generally kind of a process that teams can go through, where the first thing is they want to kind of define what's our common ground, what's our common goal. We need to reduce the budget by 10%, right? That's our common goal. How do we then go about doing that? Well, then we can brainstorm, right? We take it to a place where everybody's got some ideas about this. No ideas are bad. We're just trying to throw everything out on the table, so make sure that we're considering all of our options. So brainstorming is a way to bring people together and not, again, there's no judgment. We just want to hear everybody's ideas. From there, going to evaluating the options, this is where you have to take a second look at those brainstormed ideas and actually make, pros and cons lists for all of them, right? Really consider, how is this going to help us? Is this really doable, workable? How much money are we actually going to save, right? The pros and cons for all those options. And when you do a thorough pro and con list, oftentimes there's one or two or three options that rise to the top pretty quickly. And then your decision becomes a lot easier. Beyond that, once you pick something, implementing something is really, I always talk about thinking about things in terms of temporary changes. When you want to make a big change, if somebody who is risk averse is like, I have to agree to make this change for all eternity, they're going to balk. They're going to put up barriers and they're going to say, I'm not okay with that, right? And to a fair point, you probably shouldn't agree to something to make a change for all eternity if you don't know how that change is going to play out, right? So someone who's more of a risk taker might say, no, we should just do it, not really thinking about the fact that maybe we need to put some guardrails up. So that risk-averse person can say, well, I'm willing to do it for maybe a month or a quarter, and then let's go back and reevaluate and see what happens. And that's actually really good for the risk taker too, to be like, okay, that's true. I'm glad you're agreeing to try it, and you're right, we should actually make sure that we're trending in the right direction, the data's all good, before we make this a permanent change. So when you decide to make a change, thinking about putting some barriers around how long we're going to try this for can make everybody feel a lot more comfortable, and it's actually best practice, right? Not making big sweeping changes without really good data will help you in the long run. Maintain the health of your organization.
And if we tie this into the skills we've been talking about, framing, psychological safety, this is constructive feedback, and steering. Those 4 phases match the kinds of skills we've been talking about. Oh boy, this is why I came. Okay, so what if, just hypothetically, you could deal with conflict before there's any conflict? Does that sound like it would be an easier conversation to have? Oh, we got one. So I use the term rules of engagement. You can call it whatever you want. I just think it's catchy and it gets people's attention. What it is talking amongst a group of people. It doesn't matter. It could be at home, could be at work, could be a team set up for a single project, could be your softball team. It is going through a set of ideas and discussions about how we as a group want to work together going forward. What does that do for us? Well, first and foremost, what does just being open to that conversation build? One word? Okay. So we're already establishing trust because we're trying to have that conversation before there's any stress. The way I describe this is if you were to have this conversation, if you were to try to build a rule set like this, when there's already friction on the team, you're trying to build the plane while you fly. Let's build it on the ground. It's a lot safer. So what does it look like? It gives you clarity. It builds trust. It focuses on what the issues that may come up are. Like, for example, if you're leading that team and you know you've got some risk takers, you've got some conservative folks on the team, and you've got some doers who are not necessarily going to want to blaze a trail, but they love a to-do list. They want to just grind on that to-do list. You can try and open that team up to understanding those strengths and how we want to work together to leverage them. And then efficiency. Once you do that, you start to have a high-performing team. So you end up in a situation where that team is really clicking because they've come together and they've decided not only what they need to do, that's the overarching goal, that's their why for being together, but now you're starting to talk about the how. And you're doing that in a very direct and mindful way. I have done this with every team I've led for over 15 years. I don't know why it's not more common. But how many people in here have had a team come together for a project or for whatever reason and had a discussion like this early, like right away, so that you have a kind of a contract with one another about how you're going to work? Has anybody done this exercise? Hands, nobody? I'm assuming no hands means this is new territory. I got you. We're good. Okay, so let's look at what these rules look like. So clear communication, these are the kinds of things we want to figure out with these simple rules. Clear communication, roles and responsibilities are really well defined so people know their lanes, they know where they're working. Structured decision making, how do we make decisions as a group? Do we require a meeting? Are there certain areas at which we don't need to get together because Brian's empowered to make a decision within this context? And then if I do, how do I communicate that to the group? And lastly, conflict resolution strategies. What do we do when we get out over our skis and things do get muddy? If you have this kind of conversation before things are awkward, you're going to have a far better chance to get through the awkward together in a way that makes you even stronger. So let's talk for a second about what some of these rules may look like. So I heard at just about every table when we were doing the group thinking exercises, the brainstorming, that gossip is a problem writ large, not necessarily even in this room, but that gossip prevents people from being open and productive with one another because it creates side channels, it creates the meeting after the meeting, it creates a lack of trust because we don't know what people are saying to one another. So a rule that I've used very, very frequently on teams that I've led is the suspense. Excuse me. We talk to people, not about people, period. We also could phrase it, we don't talk about people who are not in the room. And I've been on a team where, and I will grant you, this stuff sounds great in this room. It's awkward when you first do it. It's awkward. But it only takes a couple of times where I had a team that was hugely dysfunctional at a plant that was underperforming. And gossip was tearing the place apart because there was lots of finger pointing and blame and shame. And we introduced this rule, this one rule. And we got to a point where an issue would be presenting itself on the plant floor and somebody would say, so-and-so didn't, and someone else on the team, not me, would say, they're not in the room. And the conversation would stop. We may need to go get that person, but they have a right to be in that room. And what happens to the person you go find to bring in the room? Huge trust. It may even be an uncomfortable conversation. There may be some guilt that's introduced, right? Ooh, I did mess that up. But I appreciate you bringing me in here and not guessing. Right? So those are the kinds of things that you can bring to a team to introduce these really simple rules that allow for that collaboration to be built on a bed of trust. And teams that do this have a far greater ability to navigate conflict. So for example, when a deadline is going to be missed, how do we communicate that? Is it a message on Teams type server or a Slack server? Is it an email? Do we call a meeting? We have that conversation now, then we all know that if that thing hasn't happened, we're on track. We have triggers that happen, and if we haven't had those triggers get fired, we're good. We all know that that's how we're operating together. So these rules are short circuits to conflict because we're mapping them out before the conflict arises. There's gonna be conflict and disagreements, but if we've already got a contract like this in place, we stand a far better chance of navigating it because we've already had the conversation about how when we weren't elevated or activated. And so it creates a really, really strong dynamic and a really strong sense of team. And we'll talk more about these in the discussion prompts.
So one more piece to this. If this is kind of a lot, just break it down to like an onboarding process, right? When you bring an individual into your organization, the more that they understand the processes, your values, all the things in the employee handbook, they understand what teams do what departments do what, that sets them up for a much more successful run at the organization. So onboarding is sort of the individual equivalent of this. Rules of engagement is more like the team equivalent. So they're both very similar concepts where you want to tell people ahead of time what's expected of them, how they use their PTO, right? How much time they have, where the pay, when do they get paid? All those things come in ahead of time so that there isn't these difficult conversations that have to happen later. But some organizations don't have a real sturdy onboarding process, and so there are a lot of gaps, and there are things that come up, and they could look like big conflicts, but people just didn't know. So using this idea in your teams is the same concept. Let's talk about these things ahead of time so that when we do encounter a situation, we know what to do. And it's not going to be a conflict, and there's not going to be a misunderstanding, and we're going to solve it, like he said, before we even start, which is such an encouraging way of thinking about conflict. We could solve it before it even starts when we have these rules of engagement. So our final, well, not final, but yeah.
I want to make one more point. My voice rebounded while Karen gave me a second. The organization or team or group's culture is the accumulated effects of their actions. That's all it is. That's what culture is. The behaviors and actions we take as a group define our culture, right? Words match actions. We can call our culture whatever we want. It's actually what we do in interacting with each other and how we approach our work. This exercise is a chance to directly define your culture. Not in totality, but huge chunks of it. So do you want a better onboarding process? Define it. Talk about it. And you're able to do so in a hypothetical way where nobody is at fault and you're able to just map things out. So this ties in deeply to a healthy and thriving culture.
All right, so putting all of these concepts together, so we're going to talk about creating a conflict positive culture which utilizes constructive conflict. So going back to that continuum from earlier on, we had destructive conflict on one side, we had fake harmony on the artificial harmony on the other side. That's where there's that back channeling, that's where there's that gossip happening. Nobody says what they really think in the meetings, but everybody's talking and has an opinion outside of the meetings. When you introduce that rule of we only talk about people when they're in the room, that starts to bring us to a place of conflict positive culture or constructive conflict, right? We're talking about things for the right reasons and we're trying to resolve them. We're not trying to talk about them for no reason. And so these are the components of a conflict positive culture. So first two go together. We need to have a high level of psychological safety, which results in trust. And from there, a lot of other things can happen. But if we don't have those two things, nothing else we can't really move the ball forward in terms of our culture. Beyond that, if we have some of those communication frameworks we talked about, framing, steering, constructive feedback, right? Those are all ways that we can approach people in a way that increases psychological safety, builds trust. And then finally, having these rules of engagement, some of the team dynamics might fit into this too, some of those rules. Now we have a framework for how we're going to operate together as a team. And Organizations and teams that do that, this takes teams that are formerly good and turns them into exceptional. Because none of that, all of your energy is going into your goals, into moving the organization forward towards the things you want. You're not having resources and time and people being, the drain of the conflict. It just takes away so much from that forward momentum. And there's plenty of organizations that build in things like legal fees or turnover. We expect to have, a certain amount of turnover every year, and we have to fire people and train them. That costs a lot of money. We expect to have a certain amount of litigation going on, so we build that into our budgets. They've just accepted that that's how it's going to be. With this framework, that starts to go way down. Those extra resources, that extra money, that extra energy starts to go way down, and it all gets channeled towards moving the organization in the same direction. And like I said, it turns companies from good into exceptional, and that's why this is so, so important.
So the teams, as Karen said, this is how you move to the next level of execution. These team strategies are absolutely, they're a cheat code to unlock performance, peace of mind, the ability to be content and peaceful at work, not have to manage all of those side conversations, not have to wonder what's going on because there's clarity. And that's what introduces the concept that we had back here, this term durable trust. Durable means that you guys are all in this together. You've got a set of agreements with one another that you know are real, and that trust becomes durable because you can withstand the tough stuff. Trust in and of itself is important, but it's like a bank account that you draw on and add to. When your words match your actions, you earn trust. And when you say, hey, trust me, we need to go this way, you're pulling on that balance. Durable trust minimizes that up and down, and it's just there. It's a foundational element of how the team works together. You made it to break time. My voice needs it anyway, so we're all grateful. So we're gonna take about 15 minutes. Hold on. Take about 15 minutes. We've got a QR code like last time. Questions can be submitted there. Nobody has to speak up and ask them out loud. We've tried to hold time this time to answer some at the end. So depending on how the group discussions go, we will try and do questions as well. But please send them in, and if we don't get to them, we'll answer them in tomorrow's email like we did last time. Have a good break.
So we're going to give you, I'm going to spend about 15, 20 minutes with these questions here. And just like last time, we have some that are a little bit more, we want you to focus on. And then if you get through the first three, the fourth and fifth one are also good to think about. So we're going to leave these up. So if you don't have one at your table, we'll just leave the slide up the whole time. And these are the things we want you to talk about together. So we don't need to read them for you, but go ahead and take about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll bring you back. All right, everybody, let's come on back. I know, our screen keeps leaving us. So some groups got through all five, some groups we're just focusing on one or two. Either way is fine. We're glad that you are considering these. There's a lot of nuance to these questions. These are the hardest questions we've asked you for the entire 3-day series. Okay, there's no right answer. There's lots of good answers though, and we heard a lot of them, and Brian's gonna share about one of them.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out this third question over here. Every table I stopped at was talking about this question. And the key part of this question, there's layers to these questions, and the key part in terms of looking at the organization and how you all work together is the would you step in part. Do you have the psychological safety to say, hey, we're not getting anywhere right now. We need to reset. And then identify that underlying need of these people all want to be heard and they're worried they're not going to be. So let's hold space. Everyone's going to get to talk would be what I'd say. Everyone's going to get a chance. We're going to go around the table clockwise, no favorites. And we're going to move forward so we can all have input and get to the best possible decision. But the key part of this is the would you step in? That really is the underlying question that take away from this and think about if there is a situation where people are just transmit, would I try and slow that down and give everybody a minute to catch up?
Yeah, and that absolutely helps people get back into their prefrontal cortex too, right? If you jump in, you can slow them down by summarizing, paraphrasing, sharing what you've heard, those active listening skills that will help them settle into their prefrontal cortex a little more and allow them to be more present. So the discussion's going to become a little more fruitful after that.
I heard one table say not to let Amy make your decisions. And if anybody's named Amy, it's not about you, it's the lizard brain.
Okay. All right, so these are our closing thoughts on navigating conflict here today, and then there's just 2 questions, so we'll address those really quickly. Some reminders to take away that healthy teams don't avoid conflict, they respond to it constructively, right? So hopefully we're taking away the idea that conflict is not a bad thing. There's ways to deal with it. There's constructive ways to deal with it. We want to avoid either ends of that continuum, right, where we say nothing or we become destructive and blaming. Listening is still the most powerful tool you have, right? So every single time we've talked, even today, we talked about asking more questions, getting more information, understanding where people are coming from, right? That reframing is based on listening to people's concerns first. Your communication style will shape the outcomes. So again, that steering is really helpful. If you know that you are doing your best to stay assertive, you can steer people back to the point at hand, and that's going to lead you to be able to solve problems more, which is what you ultimately want. Most meetings are about how are we going to solve this? How are we going to come together and figure this out and come up with an idea? Barriers are normal, and then they're not permanent. They're often temporary. When you don't have a lot of practice dealing with barriers, they can seem very permanent. They can seem very overwhelming. And yet at the same time, hopefully today we talked about being able to categorize some of them, how to break down them. That was exercise 1, exercise 2, and you have some more ideas about how to break those down and manage them in your day-to-day.
I want to just point out the 2 barriers that I heard talked about the most frequently throughout the day for this group that they were bringing up repeatedly. I talked about gossip earlier and space. And space meaning it's a small team, we're all in this room together, but spread out across the fairgrounds. So you don't see these people very often. You're not in a room like this very often. Trust is hard to build when you're spread all over, whatever it is, 113 acres. I don't remember. But when you're spread that far out, not seeing each other in person makes it harder to build the bonds that we've been talking about here. So those are the 2 barriers that are very real and very tangible that I heard talked about: gossip, space.
And the last one, building trust. We talk about it as this sort of overarching theme for all of our work, but as Brian said earlier, culture is built in these small interactions over and over and over again. So to have a trusting culture, it almost goes down to the granular of one-to-one. When someone comes to you and has an opinion or a thought about something, it's how you respond in that moment that helps build trust for the next time. If you're dismissive in that moment, maybe they'll come to you again, maybe a 3rd time, but if you continue to be dismissive, they're not going to keep coming to you, right? So that's the progress, that's the pattern of how culture develops. So if you want to undo that or you want to build trust, you can think about it's doing the opposite, right? How can I be more open, more receptive, more approachable?
And you may have to declare that. And by that I mean tell people, like, I would like to talk about this for these reasons or whatever. As Karen said earlier, you may have to announce that you're changing your perspective or your patterns because people need to trust that that's real. Otherwise, it might feel really uncomfortable for them. Let me talk about the survey and then we'll see if we can get to the questions. So we're done. You all did a great job. And I want to thank you for being so engaged. You're going to get a survey, a link to a survey on the email tomorrow. That's to help us understand how this landed, where there needs to be focus, what was working, what you want to be able to action. There's going to be some chances for you to, give us your thoughts and your opinions about what the organization may or may not need in this sphere. The survey will be anonymous unless you choose in the last field to put your email address in because you want to be contacted for follow-up. If you don't put anything in that field and it'll be optional, your answers are all anonymous. There's not going to be any ability to trace them back. And it's about getting these things integrated into the culture, not about who said what. So when you do have that chance to take that survey, please give it a little bit of time. It's only 10 or 12 questions. It will take 5 to 10 minutes because most of the questions are just selecting a range and a number. So we're going to leave it open until Monday at the close of business. So you have a few days to get it done. The link will be in the email tomorrow. You'll get a wrap-up email tomorrow, as you have with the others, with some summaries, a couple of other resources, and an attachment of this deck. Okay? So we're going to go through the 2 questions that got submitted at the break, and we'll be here afterwards if you have any other questions. But otherwise, we're both super grateful that you had us, and this has been a wonderful experience.
Thank you so much. All right, so I've got one question, Brian's got another. One question, what are some other helpful ways to prevent gossip? You had some good suggestions, but I'm looking for more tips from a gossip addict that's trying to recover. I mean, aren't we all? So first of all, thinking about your conversations, like I said earlier, are you talking about somebody that's not in the room? There is a way that you could be talking about somebody who's not in the room because you're looking for guidance about how to then go to them. Maybe you're inexperienced. Maybe you don't have a lot of experience doing this type of thing. So you're asking someone who you know is going to be helpful to you and can offer you some guidance about how to do that so that you can figure out the best way to approach. Doesn't have to be a therapist. It could be a coworker. It could be a friend. It could be somebody that you trust that kind of does interpersonal stuff well. But then bringing back that to the person themselves. How to approach it. You know, there's texting, there's email, there's in-person. Depending on your level of comfort, in-person is the most effective, but sometimes the hardest because you kind of have to think about what you're going to say. You can't really read over your text message. You can't really read over an email and make sure it sounds exactly like what you want it to say. But those things are a little less personal. So that's the trade-off. You could text somebody about your concerns. It gives you a chance to really think through what you want to say, make sure it's really clear. Or talking in person gives you more that face-to-face. People understand you're taking a bigger risk by coming to them directly. Hopefully they appreciate it. You could even say, you know, I was going to text you this, but I'm actually coming to you to tell you this. But you're going to have to kind of memorize what you want to say and think through it ahead of time. I don't recommend kind of going on the fly a lot of times with this stuff because when you're getting started, you don't want to say things that, you know, you don't plan out ahead of time. So those are some ideas for you.
And if you're still building trust with somebody, if you had some notes, you can say, hey, this is new for me and I'm uncomfortable, and have your notes. You just want to get it right. And you're showing somebody, I respected this conversation with you enough to think about it ahead of time and try and really get my thoughts together. There's no shame in that. That's wonderful to see. It's a commitment to really having somebody understand you and you understand them. The other question we had is, what level of an organization is responsible for leading this kind of work? So the answer to that is, there's a couple of levels to it. My glib answer is everybody. But there's a but, and I don't usually use buts. These practices have to be established and championed at the top. And the leaders across the organization are the models that the broader organization looks to for these behaviors to be real. If we say we're going to do something and our actions don't match our words, then the broader group is going to be like, oh, we're not really doing that. It's okay. I'm not going to either. If we see those words matching actions, it cascades down, and it's incumbent upon everybody in the group then to say, okay, we're committing to this. We're going to do this together. So it starts with modeling, and it cascades through the organization of building some trust that, yep, this is what we're going to do and how we're going to behave. And then you become a culture where somebody does step in that meeting and help those people talking at each other slow down and listen to one another before they just are freight trains passing each other in the night. So it's everybody, but there's levels of commitment in terms of how that takes root and becomes part of the culture. All right? Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.